can and you do want to, like and subscribe and share.
To get every notification, just ring the black bell. So, the Uncivil War of Federalist Crimes Against Humanity during the War of Northern Aggression. And this is the original flag of the Confederacy. Underneath is the battle flag that we're so familiar with. But in fact, the Confederate flag was very similar to the original. And if you're familiar with the Uncivil War of Northern Aggression, it's quite a nightmare. It's essentially the first major war that were demonstrated industrialization of automatic weapons, major explosives like dynamite. More in another video specifically on technology in the Bright Age. All sorts of crazy weapons. Eli Whitney and standardization leads to mass manufacturing, which makes it possible to produce large amounts of these weapons quickly. For some reason, all of these machines that can dig out California gold were digging these trenches by hand. These are the elite forces digging out these trenches, probably more likely an archaeological dig. They can find something. And whether or not Archimedes had models of these weapons or they existed in ancient times, this is the first time in recent memory that media has made news about them for us to see. For instance, the Gatling gun. But I really want to talk a bit about Confederate submarines. They are a fantastic and interesting thing. And there were Yankee submarines as well, at least the Alligator. But after the war, some of the Confederate technology becomes declassified and available to the public, such as H.L. Hunley's submarine. It's a fantastic design. It has a propeller that is spun through the center. Men will spin it sort of like an egg beater or a bicycle. This is the Pioneer in St. John's Bayou. I saw this one. It got stuck on some seaweed or kelp, the propeller unable to pull out of the underwater, and it was unable to detangle. That's at least the story. And that gets into the tunnels and the literal underground railroads, because there were. And I've always heard that, wondering about the underground railroads. And when I was a kid, I asked, was it a real railroad? Some adults will say no. Other ones knew, yes, there were underground railroads and certainly tunnel systems. And they were used to connect to mansions, which then would take them to other locations. In many circumstances, there was a map that connected underground tunnels. Doctors are sawing legs off in shock without any sort of, essentially just robbing women and children of their sons and fathers, taking them down from the potato famine. Drafting it's conscripting men, and they're killing them 20-1 often. Grant says, send me more troops, drunkenly, because they get killed a lot. It's okay because every 20 men, they get 20 more men, but there's only so many Southerners. And notice these tunnels. And they didn't just fight around their houses, they fought in their houses often. Like, this was not fought far-flung from where their homes were. They were defending their homes, for some perspective. Watch Gangs of New York, again, for some perspective on how the North actually felt, the way they treated Irish and African Americans, not the South, which was a rather glamorous culture, especially in French areas like Louisiana. So we're told about General Sherman, who marched across, destroying the towns. If you ever see a hand put in a jacket like that, it means they're keeping a secret. We were told that the potato famine was a natural blight. It could have been just a reason of monocropping, and that's a lovely story, but it actually was a deliberate event in order to kill off as many Irish as possible. The food was evacuated from the country. The people were starved and killed, and they were kept from eating seaweed. Even. This is something that has happened before and will happen again. One of the examples, of course, is the Holodomor of the Ukraine, which is a tragedy not even describable, but let me try. They took a bunch of kids, they shot them if they picked grain off the ground, they starved them to death while they made them work, and then they took all the wheat and food and sold it, and this is how they emptied the Ukraine. And we'll get into why the Ukraine is so important to this Georgian man, Stalin. So it was a time of starvation and emigration, where men and women and children were sent in mass exodus from their homes across the world. And there are trains that actually took boys and girls to all over the country, the lost boy generation of the 18th and 17th and the 19th century. And if you've ever heard of being Shanghaied, where you wake up on a boat on the way to Shanghai, well, a lot of these boys became soldiers, and it didn't always work out well. Here's an example of blast wounds. So these are the kids, by the way, that were... And I bet this guy didn't have a slave. He was one, though. He was an indentured servant. They want you to forget, and the only way to do that is to tear down any physical remnants and any iconography, and to obscure the intention. And the alternative narrative, of course, is that once the Confederacy were a free people, it was the Second War of Independence, and there were a lot of African Americans that fought on the side of the Confederacy and kept their pride into their elderly years. My father's generation were probably the last kids to get to meet Confederate and Yankee soldiers that were still around after the war. But they have a very specific narrative that doesn't really fit with what we're told. Essentially, the more you look into it, it makes a lot more sense why there were so many Confederate African Americans. They saw the Slavery Emancipation Proclamation, which only liberate Confederate slaves who had rebelled. The North slaves would still be in slavery. Imagine finding out, and by us being an American slave who could read, which there were, and finding out that they were not freed because they were able to understand the fine print. And then began the period of deconstruction. 15 years of complete control where there were soldiers guarded on all corners. And simultaneous wars goes on and on around the world. Particularly Franco wars are interesting to look at, such as the Franco-Swedish and the Second French intervention in Mexico, which happens simultaneously to the war in the United States and the Yankees during their martial law occupation of the South. Notice also the Franco uniforms are very similar to the Yankee uniforms, and it can be said that the war may have existed because of the inability to enforce the Monroe Doctrine internationally abroad of the United States. And these are the kids who fought for the Confederacy, just for some more perspective. And you could say that they were just forced to fight, but I'll tell you a little bit about this guy he died in his backyard defending his sisters in the house, and his last words were home, 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 as he died in the field. It wasn't that he, wanted to fight so much, but that he kind of had to. But he got left holding the bag, like an entire new nation got left holding the bag. And it's interesting it's not remembered so much for the ending of slavery, that instead it's remembered for the history that came before it, and it's the history that we're trying to discover, that we're being kept from. This gets into the idea that once we were free, because when the 13th Amendment mentioned slavery for the first time in the Constitution, it actually defined its use, where it says slavery or involuntary servitude shall exist as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Literally legalized slavery. So there's that. Oh yeah, and why is it called slavery again? It comes from Slavic people, from when they were objectified so often it became a verb by the Moorish slavers, Slavers. 12 years a Slav. And the tie comes from Croatia. It's the cravat, a Slavic invention. This is how we do, or how we did, because this is more how we're seen these days, apparently. But I get back to the Paraguay Triple Alliance War, which genocided 90% of the population. But it's very similar that in 1865, and all this is happening simultaneously, remember. Paraguay is having the Triple Alliance War at the exact same time as the Uncivil War of Northern Aggression and wiping out 90% of the populations. And they are literate people then, but that's all the more to the point about Tartaria. So these are some of the remnants of their people. And in the north of Paraguay, in the west, is a place called Philadelphia, where every sign is in German. I've actually been there. There's literally a street called South Hindenburg Avenue. It's just fantastic and interesting that there's not much more than dirt roads everywhere, but these beautiful brick buildings. It's some of the most fantastic deep basement buildings you're going to find in Paraguay, and perhaps the world. Interesting architecture abound.
If you can, and you do want to, like and subscribe and share.
To get every notification, just ring the black bell.